to Diving Deeper Discussions. My name is Keith Miller, and I am your host today for this regular monthly series of discussions focused on an article or book published in the ASA journal, Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith. And today, our guest is Michel Gagné. Michel teaches courses in critical thinking, political philosophy, and ethics at Champlain College in St. Lambert, Quebec. And we want to welcome Michel to Diving Deeper. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And a little bit about his vita. Michel has written two interesting and highly relevant book reviews for the ASA Journal, one that we'll be talking about today, which is QAnon, Chaos, and the Cross, and the other, Creating Conspiracy Beliefs, How Our Thoughts Are Shaped. And he's also written a review of another book on similar topics for the ASA. Michel is an historian by training and a philosopher by profession. He holds a BA in History and Political Science and a BA Education in 1999, both from McGill University, as well as an MA in History from Concordia University. He has taught at the primary, secondary, and collegiate levels since the 1990s and is a tenured lecturer at Champlain College, where he teaches in the Humanities Department. His main fields of teaching and research are political philosophy, utopian philosophy, philosophy of religion, ethics, and conspiracy beliefs. He is the author of Thinking Critically about the Kennedy assassination, debunking the myths and conspiracy theories. And he has also authored several articles in academic journals, encyclopedias, magazines, and news media, and also has been featured on several TV, radio, and podcast interviews. And he is the creator and host of Paranoid Planet podcast, a monthly program that takes a critical look at conspiracy theories, cultish groups, and pseudo-history. And before we jump into the discussion, I want to let you know, get to know Michael a little bit better. So I first want to ask Michael a bit about the reason that you came to an interest in conspiracy theories.
I began as a conspiracist, so someone who actually believed in the theories. Not all of them, thank goodness. But I did grow up with an avid interest in space and UFOs as a kid. I think you couldn't avoid that in the 1970s. It was the era of Star Wars, after all. But I think it was really more in my early 20s when I was in university that I found myself becoming very suspicious of government and various power brokers. I think conspiracy theories do appeal to people who have a certain amount of education so they can follow the story, complex stories about, international plots and intrigues, but at the same time, not enough in-depth knowledge about a particular topic so that a very general, perhaps not very well proven theory, it rings true. But also, I think a lot of belief in conspiracy theories comes from emotions, particularly anxiety and a sense of powerlessness. And I think I was dealing with some of that as a young man. And it's only when I became a college lecturer in the late 2000s that I realized that I was getting very excited every time somebody mentioned the Kennedy assassination. I would probably read about it obsessively, but I realized I was only reading one side of the argument. And like many Americans and many Canadians, there's a tendency to believe that either the mafia or the CIA or some other group did it, maybe acting together, because that's the story we're bombarded with all the time, particularly through Hollywood. And so as I was teaching a course on critical thinking, a colleague of mine introduced a new course on thinking critically about conspiracy theories, and I thought, I'd like to teach that. And I started deprogramming myself while I was at the same time trying to encourage my students to think more critically. So around 2008, 2010, I realized, I really have to get back into this Kennedy thing. And I spent about 10 years working on a treatment, which it turned out to be a 500-page book which is actually pretty short for conspiracy books about Kennedy. And I found myself debunking almost every argument that I had come across before. So that book got published in 2022, but it was largely written by 2018. So I would say that by the late 2010s, I was firmly in the skeptical side, both for the Kennedy assassination and the 9/11 attacks, which I think were the two things that had kind of drawn me in the most. I don't think that I was believing in many other conspiracy theories, but there's so many out there. It's like a cafeteria, you can just eat lasagna all the time, but you're still at the crazy buffet or something. So that's what I was doing. And by then I've become a staunch advocate for thinking critically, particularly about conspiracy theories. And since I am a Christian, I have a particular interest in guiding other believers into thinking more carefully about their own assumptions and biases, and particularly how their emotions can lead them to that. So when Chris Berriger, a member of your organization, he's a minister that I knew well, he and I were talking about the books that we were respectively writing, and he got me into reviewing some books, which includes the one that we are going to talk about today. So I don't know if that gives you kind of an overall sense of where I'm coming from.
Yeah. Before the meeting, you were mentioning some of your publications and other publications that you felt were important. That might be a good time to mention those. If you want to put them up, use your
Sure.
share screen, you can go ahead and do that.
So now since you mentioned it, since you're giving me the right to bragging rights or something, I am going to share my screen and just show you two publications that I've done that may be of interest to people. So this is the review I wrote for your magazine. My book is called Thinking Critically About the Kennedy Assassination. It is a brick, but I would say it's a small brick comparatively. If you're interested in delving deep into the Kennedy assassination and particularly understanding how President Kennedy became a bit of a mythological figure. So the book, it was published by Routledge Press in 2022. It's available on Amazon, and you can go to the publisher's website. And I try to outline not all, but the vast majority of the claims about Kennedy. Certainly the major ones. There are a lot of references to Oliver Stone's famous film JFK in there. So that people can get a general idea that President Kennedy has been misunderstood in many ways, even by mainstream historians who don't believe in a conspiracy theory. I kind of start with the idea that President Kennedy's life is largely mythologized, and then I move on to how the conspiracy theories have given us a very different view of history, to the point that the evidence has become so murky that one almost needs a PhD to look into it. So hopefully my book will help people avoid having to go back to grad school to unravel why I certainly believe, and I think all the evidence points to, a single lone gunman who we could describe as a domestic terrorist who also had some emotional and psychiatric problems. The other piece that I wrote, which is free, it's available to you if you want to read it later today or at some other time. It's an article called The High Cabal and the Lynch Mob, exploring conspiracism through René Girard's scapegoating theory. So René Girard was a French Catholic anthropologist, a literary critic, and he looked at both how the Bible and other books, ancient books, deal differently with how we other individuals who we don't like. And Christ is the best example of one who was destroyed, executed, by not just the authorities, but also the crowds who did not like what he was selling. Well, not selling, but what the message that he was promoting. And so I kind of start a little bit with who René Girard was and what scapegoating is, and then I look at how conspiracy theories play a role that is very much like a cultic religion in the minds of the people who follow conspiracy theories. There are some differences. Obviously, a lot of people who follow conspiracy theories do this individually, with their laptops, not necessarily in their mother's basement, but It's not done in groups, but it can be, or many times in online communities. And I presented this as a paper at the Harvard Divinity School, as well as the International Cultic Studies Association, and that's the website you see there, and that's the link to the article. So if anybody wants to, you can email me later. I'll be happy to share that or other links. You can email me at paranoidplanet.mail@gmail.com. So I can put that later on, or maybe Vicky can post that.
Thank you very much. So I had a couple of questions I thought I'd ask you, particularly about a couple essays in the book to get things rolling and maybe help people in our audience have something to dialogue around. And so first off, this is the the book we'll be discussing. QAnon, Chaos and the Cross, Christianity, Conspiracy Theories. Has a very diverse collection of short essays. But one of them that you, Michel, thought highly of, and so did I in reading it, was called The Cost of Debunking Conspiracy Theories by Scott Culpepper. And it's dealing with Mike Warnke. I don't know how many other people here, raise your hand, how many other people here have heard about Mike Warnke? Yeah, I thought so. I actually heard him at a Jesus 73 festival back in the beginning of the Jesus movements. And he was one of the speakers. And I found this article really interesting. The fictitious stories used by Mike Warnke, which dealt with his supposed history in Satan worship, stimulated others to likewise create fictional stories of their own that amplified Warnke's claims. Their stories resulted in TV coverage by Geraldo Rivera and the endorsement of the popular writer Hal Lindsey, leading to the book Satan is Alive and Well on Planet Earth. So some of you may be familiar with that history. So my question is, do you think that this example provides a useful description of how many conspiracy theories begin and are spread?
I mean, every conspiracy theory, I think, comes from different ideological or cultural background. So I think it's hard to overgeneralize. Certainly, I think among Christians who would identify as evangelicals or Christian conservatives, there are certain key triggers. And certainly child abuse is one of them, as it is also in feminist and other ideas. But it seems that Christians are particularly susceptible to believe in child molestation conspiracies. And so should we be, we should be sensitive to any claim of sexual abuse. The problem is, I think, that what happened in the so-called satanic panic of the 1980s, during which I was a teenager, and I was hearing a lot of this about backmasking and abductions and things like that while I was going to to youth group on Friday nights. The problem with that is it gave us a grand narrative that if you stand back from a distance emotionally and look at just what is claimed to be true, it is farcical. We're talking about thousands, perhaps millions of secret Satanists having covens in their basements or in childhood daycares and ritually abusing and murdering and hiding bodies. None of those bodies were ever found. No names were ever given, right? So what happens, it becomes fodder that you would assume to see more in a horror movie or some great apocalyptic film. But people fell for it because everyone was repeating it. So I think I and many people who were in the evangelical church and of a certain age in the 1980s were caught in an echo chamber. And our Christian leaders, often from the pulpit or people like Mike Warnke, who is, I saw him once on a videotape at a youth group. I can't say I thought he was that funny, but he was at that time billed as the funniest Christian stand-up comedian around. Now, I think there are some much funnier Christian comedians around now, but Warnke did have that cachet. So people passed the videotapes around and, or went to see him live. And then he would end his concerts, his stand-up routines, getting more serious, talking about Satanism, possession, abuse, and starting an altar call. So fear, concern of harm for the vulnerable people certainly is something very seductive. And when we're trained in the literature, now this is also the time when people are reading Frank Peretti's novels, This Present Darkness, or Tim LaHaye's novels, the Left Behind novels. We were so chronically bombarded by this information. There was no internet in the 80s, but today we could see that if you only go to certain websites that are sort of more or less approved by your denomination, then you're likely to also not be given any counter arguments. So I think what happened there in the 1980s is perhaps exceptional in the way that it came about, but it gives us definitely a blueprint for what happens when a community that is somewhat insular, that is emotionally anxious, and has a personal narrative of us and them, a siege mentality, then these things will lead to conspiracy fear. And it's not an accident that 30 years later, the same type of, a different story, but the same type of concerns gave rise to the QAnon conspiracy theories. Does that answer the question?
That makes a good segue into one more question that I thought talk about QAnon again, hopefully getting people thinking here. There's an article or essay on religious rhetoric of QAnon, and he gives examples of a civil religion, repetition of God bless America, spiritual language, spiritual warfare language, and using scripture passages and kind of performative prayer to grab an audience. And my question is the ubiquitous conflation of God, country, maybe in the military, just a post-World War II trend, or is it something older than that?
Well, I don't think so, but also I'm speaking from a Canadian perspective, particularly from the province of Quebec. So my perspective is very different than Christians in the United States. Probably because, or largely because, as a Protestant evangelical in the province of Quebec, I am part of a very small minority. A little bit like Anabaptists at the time of the Protestant Reformation, there was no leading community that is giving you much press or support. So it's easier to curl in on yourself in Quebec and say the whole world is against us. In other parts of Canada, like Alberta, the Bible Belt in Canada, and especially many parts of the United States, there is a tendency to sometimes conflate civil religion with, our which should be our theological interests. And as a Canadian, I am amazed and surprised and sometimes dismayed by the amount of militarism in Christian culture in the United States, in culture in general. The phrase, thank you for your service, is a very polite one. But I'm always amazed how the military gets high regards in the United States, but say teachers and nurses don't. And in a Christian culture, we would assume that people who go out and serve the public, teachers and nurses being, I think, part of the vanguard, would probably be the ones that we would most focus on. Whether in the Catholic tradition with, St. Francis of Assisi, or in the more Protestant culture with people like, Martin Luther King Jr., for example, or Desmond Tutu in South Africa, I think these are the people that should stand up as the ones who are doing God's work. So there is a tendency sometimes to conflate the military or militarism with defending Christian values. They're certainly defending American civil liberties, which, in Canada as well, we value those too, freedom of speech. It is certainly true that the world is a horrible place and a lot of people do nasty things. And as a Canadian, I much prefer being beside the United States than Russia. There's no doubt about that. But I think as Christians, there is a tendency to follow the flow, particularly when we are in the majority. And as an historian who studied the rise of Christianity in Rome, while Constantine did many good things for Christians, at the same time, it was a double-edged sword. It was a poison pill that put Christians in position of power where they could do a lot of harm to other Christians or people they deemed to be heretics or non-believers. And it turns out they did a lot more harm to other variations of Christians than to pagans. The centuries after Constantine could be very bloody towards heretics, not so much for pagans. So I think what happens in place of the United States, there's a culture war going on, or they've been going on for some time, and many individuals have a tendency to get behind their respective what do you call them? Their dividing lines, but internally there's a lot of animosity directed at people who are not quite towing the line. And I noticed this both in you raised the issue regarding Mike Warnke. At that time, a lot of Christian media supported Mike Warnke, including Christianity Today, great magazine. I listened to their podcasts. But at that time, they were definitely on the wrong side. They were endorsing a lot of the satanic panic. 30, 40 years later, they spoke out against the extremes of Trumpism among Republicans, the MAGA movement. And there, they were basically shown the door by many Christian denominations. I very much appreciate what Christianity Today is doing now to try to keep Christians focused on the kingdom of God and not the kingdom of Trump. But unfortunately, they're like a voice in the wilderness now. Maybe they've learned their lesson from what happened. In the 1980s, it was Cornerstone that was kind of on the vanguard of trying to keep Christians Christian from the civil religion. And I think Christianity Today has done a lot more recently to try to do that. I listened to an interview with Adam Kinzinger, a former representative who was one of the only Republicans to be on the commission, the January 6th commission. And he was essentially lambasted by most Christians and other Republicans. And that's unfortunate because after listening to him, I thought, if anything, if I've ever heard of a man of God inside the halls of Congress, he was certainly one of them. Apart from him, the other voices were largely from the Mormon Church, which is, for evangelicals and other Christians, we should say, well, there's a problem when the people we might call a cult or something are actually leading the way, promoting more Christ-like behavior. I don't know. Does that answer the question?
Yeah. So why don't we open it up? And so anyone that has a question, feel free to raise a hand and we'll call on you. Mark?
I thought there was a question in the chat, but I'm not sure if we're going to read that.
I'll go with Mark, and then if there's a question in the chat, we'll do that.
That was mine, I believe. And there was two questions. I'll take them just one at a time because they're related but different. The first one is whether, because Christians believe in, hard to explain things like miracles and answered prayer, are we distinctly vulnerable to conspiracies and misinformation, and that it's not a big leap to believe things that are pretty easily explained as being irrational? So answered prayer and miracles are pretty irrational, and so we have a process by which we do believe in them, but it's not just a random leap into saying, well, if you say it, it must be true. So are Christians particularly vulnerable to this, and are we uniquely responsible for the acceleration and perpetuation of this in the last 10 years?
I'll try to answer that as succinctly as I can. I think this is more of an issue, I think, of naturalism and supernaturalism. When Christians are debating, say, atheists, there is a tendency to want to believe in things that naturalists would say, well, that's not scientifically possible, right? So, young Earth creationism on flat Earth might be the extreme form, but, a lot of Christians believe in demon possession. And if a person is exhibiting strange behavior, certainly that might be in the top 10 list, and maybe close to the top of the list of some of the reasons we might use to explain the behavior, when others will say, no, it's got to be schizophrenia or something like that. So I definitely believe that supernaturalism, which is ingrained in the Christian faith, will often lead us into conflicts with people who have a naturalistic worldview. But I think that's a different question than conspiracy theories. Believing in angels that, are taking care of me will not lead me to believe that there is a widespread conspiracy to destroy me or my freedoms. I often compare conspiracy theories to a kind of a religion that has a Satan but no God. There is a supernatural evil, but unfortunately, the dark reality of many conspiracy theories, the one that makes it very despairing, is the fact that unless humans do something, the whole world will either end or go, the way of evil or destruction. And that's where the danger lies. I don't think it's supernaturalism per se. It's giving into a sense of anxiety, the fear that we are never going to win this, and this tends to be the wrong fight. It tends to be a fight, say, for the next election, or for having the right kind of policy or budgets on things, I don't know, like abortion. Or in Canada, assisted dying was a huge one. In fact, the fact that I call it assisted dying shows the power of the lobby, because it's suicide. I believe that, sometimes people people are terminally ill and we should help them in their pain. But in Canada, pain has been equated with evil. And, it's very, very easy to apply for assisted suicide. So in those cases, I think when there is a large moral gap and the anxious sense that we're never going to be heard, and we put our faith not in the kingdom of God, but in some sort of political ideology or political program, then there's the tendency to believe in conspiracy theories, that somehow the game is rigged. And that's a very sad place to be. I think what motivated me to believe in conspiracy theories was not so much political anxiety, but personal anxieties. I think, when I was in my 20s, I lost a friend in a car crash. I certainly felt that maybe my career choices were mistaken. Becoming a teacher, let's face it, I'm not going to be able to live on the lap of luxury. So I think there was a sense that I was on the losing side of history, and that somehow made me believe more that somehow the CIA or these other organizations are so powerful that I have to fight with all that I can. Now, most conspiracy theorists are very peaceful people, but on occasion you will see them who will pick up a gun or some other weapon in the name of defending freedom. Edgar Madison Welch is the man who went into a pizzeria in Washington, D.C., and with an AR-15 and demanded that they release the children that Hillary Clinton had locked in the basement. This happened in 2016, I think. Well, there was no basement at the Comet Ping Pong. I know, I've been there twice. The pizza's great, but there's no basement. So the stories were passed around, and the fear, the anxiety made them lash out. So, sorry, that's a parenthesis, but Christians, when they lose sight that the kingdom of God is going to happen, the war has been won. If they understand what the war is, it's a spiritual war for our souls. And the people on the other side are not our enemies. They are potential friends, converts, fellow citizens of the kingdom of God. We shouldn't be fighting with them. We should be reaching out, because, by making friends, we help them see Jesus. By making enemies, we just make them see us. I don't know if that answers your question, but
yeah, that's very helpful. In fact, at the risk of jumping in front of Alan, because you already alluded to it, then do you see an association between atypical psychological issues like anxiety disorder, paranoia, and so people who have those, or is that also not necessarily a very direct association, similar to being a Christian and believing in supernatural or spiritual things? And then I'll stop with my questions.
So briefly, in the academic literature, there's at least 4 or 5 different strands of people who will say this is what causes conspiracy thinking. The political scientists will say it's power asymmetries. If the president you love is not in power, then you'll believe in conspiracy theories. Yes, that happens sometimes. Also, I believe, and this is more my view, is that if existentially you feel powerless, you're going to believe in various ways that people are manipulating you. But I think there's a very strong case to be made that for many people, there are psychological factors, not psychiatric factors. Some people are deluded and they need help, but they're not the type of people who will lead an entire movement. Alex Jones is not schizophrenic, he's an emotional bully. But there are many things that lead us to feel either anxious, powerless, self-entitled. Narcissism plays a large role there as well. I have a long list. Well, I have a list of them, but I don't know if I have time, but I could show you a list of 8 different psychological factors that can help us. Would that be okay, Keith? Can I do that?
Don't want to cut people off. Are there
Okay.
any other waiting questions?
I was wondering specifically if there were special factors that you would identify around science-related conspiracy theories that, may be a little less crazy than QAnon, but for example, that scientists really know that evolution is false, but they're conspiring to hide the truth, or that climate change is a hoax, or various conspiracy theories around vaccines. Do you see special factors around Christians falling for those, such as sort of the long-standing view in some Christian circles that sees science and scientists as an enemy?
Yeah, that's hard to answer because my background is not in the sciences. I usually start a lot of my lectures with a disclaimer. I'm not an expert on this. So in this particular case, what I could say is a lot of it comes with mistrust. Christians tend to mistrust elites who seem to be giving a different narrative of who we are, why we're here. And there's no doubt that since Darwin and the theory of evolution became popular, we can think of the Scopes monkey trials and things like that. There's been a lot of pushback. Philosopher Qasim Qassam has identified various elements of conspiracy theories, and one of them is contrarianism. People who believe in conspiracy theories don't necessarily believe in the conspiracy theory per se. They don't want to believe in the other story. And the conspiracy theory offers a convenient counterpoint, a counterposition to what they are opposing. So if people believe that, and my expertise is in Kennedy, for example, that John F. Kennedy could not have been murdered by an unstable lone gunman, then any theory becomes acceptable. And quite often they're contradictory theories. The Russians and the CIA don't work together, but someone could decide to combine those things because it offers an opposition to the story they don't want to believe. So as far as science goes, I think the problem is that science is constantly kind of recalibrating what it believes to be the reigning theory, right? There's always adjustments, and every now and then there's a scientific revolution that leads to a completely different new paradigm, as Thomas Kuhn famously described it. And Christians have a paradigm, and it's fairly fixed. Now, it's interesting that it's not as fixed as they think. Young Earth creationism is not something that originates with St. Augustine or before. It originates from the late 19th, early 20th century. Bishop Ussher, is one of the first ones to try to calculate the origins of the Earth to 4004 BC or something like that. That's not that long ago. So I think the problem is that Christians often assume that their position is the one that the Bible teaches, rather than understanding that it's an interpretation. For example, reading the book of Revelation through the lens of the Cold War in the 1980s led you to see Russians and Americans all over the place. But it turns out, once the Cold War was over, people kind of smacked their heads, or they just conveniently ignore that and find some other interpretation. So I can't say too much about the scientific theories, but certainly being aware of the debates within the scientific disciplines would really help a lot of Christians to realize that, okay, this is not set in stone. There's a debate going on here, and Christians can participate, but at the same time realize that they should also bring evidence to the table, not just their own set of assumptions. In terms of vaccines, it would be very useful for many Christians to realize that the entire argument that autism causes vaccines has been so thoroughly debunked, and that one of the men behind it, I'm trying to remember his name, the British doctor, Andrew Wakefield, turns out he was really just trying to get a patent to push his own vaccines to make a lot of money out of it. So being able to read up on that, people who are vaccine resistant, might more easily see that there are a lot of quacks and hoaxsters on their side of the fence, and they might want to be a little bit more cautious before they level accusations against, I don't know, Dr. Fauci or the CDC. There's no doubt there's a lot of politics in science. At the same time, I think there's a lot of good people who are looking for a good. So if believers in conspiracy theories can see that it's almost impossible to keep the scientific community or the political community all towing one line, then they would realize that these grand conspiracy theories are very easily debunked, if only the fact that secrets can't be kept at that level for that long. You know, even in China, information leaks out. Now, we're still waiting to see about whether there was a lab leak, right? But I'm not particularly invested emotionally in one way or the other. Does that help? I don't know if that helps answer your question.
Yeah.
I am not a scientist, so I'll concede that's not my maybe that's not the best answer available.
And there was another question. Del, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to expand a little bit on Alan's question and take it out of just are Christians potentially more susceptible to conspiracy theories, but is there any academic literature, any studies you know of about religious people in general who have, obviously our mindset is either God's in charge or it's a satanic plot, but I'm just wondering if there's something psychologically where we are hardwired to see things that someone has to be in charge, emphasis on one, not that things don't just happen. And when I say don't, quote, just happen, I'm including, human agencies like Adam Smith's, how we get our breakfast with Adam Smith's economics. Nobody sits down and plans it. It's the individual actions of a number of independent people. There really is there something about religion that makes people more or less susceptible to conspiracies, or is there any work that has been done to find out?
Well, I think some religions are able to steer clear, or some denominations or various groups are able to steer clear of conspiracy thinking, and others tend to, get into it hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah.
So I would be hesitant to say that religion does this or religion does that. But you asked me if there's anything in the academic literature that speaks to this, and yes, and one particular book that I enjoyed is written by a former retired political science professor from Syracuse called Michael Barkan. Barkan is Jewish, and I interviewed him in my podcast, lovely man, and he talks about two particular phenomena that I think you might be interested in. The first one is the concept of stigmatized knowledge. So stigmatized knowledge happens when a community that is fairly closed, some evangelicals, Hasidic Jews, certainly anything we might call a cultish group, from the Raelians to Jonestown, are quite insular. They believe the world has it all wrong, and they believe that their theory of either human origins or God or the soul or whatever it is the only right one. So often when you have a very charismatic leader who rallies around some theory, their pet theory, and there's not much information coming from outside, what we might call an echo chamber, you will have what we call stigmatized knowledge. So a set of claims that are considered to be true by the people inside the group, but that the rest of the world finds to be silly or ludicrous or just plain unscientific. And because the world seems to think that, the group being stigmatized, in other words, believing that they are rejected because they know the truth. You also see this in the ufology groups. I'm doing a lot of research right now on, people who believe in flying saucers and alien visitors and that sort of thing. So stigmatized knowledge is one of them. I think it explains a lot for when a group, it doesn't have to be a religious group, but many religious groups do that when they're kind of closed in on themselves, tend to have the belief that they are victims because they know better. And so that's the first one. The second one is millennialism. And Christians can be particularly susceptible to believing that the end of the world is nigh. And when you believe that, then any change to your agenda, your belief system, your freedoms is seen as an attack. Perhaps one that'll be the final one in a series of, a downward spiral until the sort of the, evil takes over, or the end of the world, if you wish. Now, it's not just Christians who do that, or even Orthodox Jews or Muslims. A lot of New Agey groups will sometimes pick and choose elements. In the QAnon, you see this a lot. In the UFO movements, you see this a lot. Picking elements of the Bible, like the wheels within wheels of Ezekiel, or some other element of the Bible, and then mixing it with New Age spirituality, other types of maybe ancient science, flat Earth theory, things like that. And then it becomes a kind of a cafeteria religion. And that's why Barkan calls it improvisational millennialism. So a millennialism that kind of picks and chooses from different religions and it creates something new. So the idea that the end of the world is nigh, and the idea that the world is against us, improvisation, millennialism, and stigmatized knowledge, are two ways that religious groups will often be susceptible to conspiracy thinking. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's helpful. I'm a little bit glad to find that it's groups as groups and not Christians as Christians that do it a lot.
Yeah. Barkan deals a lot with white nationalists, neo-Nazis, and other types of kind of extreme groups in the United States. As a Jewish author, I understand why he's particularly concerned in those types of cultish and conspiracy dynamics. His book is called A Culture of Conspiracy. It's about 15 years old now, the second edition, but I think it's quite still pertinent. Although I won't talk about QAnon, it kind of predates the QAnon business. Barkun is spelled Barkun. Barkan, sorry, you pronounce it Barkan.
Yeah, good afternoon all. I work as a professor at Anderson University in South Carolina. And recently I have proposed a new course that will be open to juniors and seniors, and it's about why we should trust science. So we're going to explore conspiracy theories and the anti-science movement. So I decided to use Francis Collins' books, The Road to Wisdom. Okay. But then I thought that it would be good to use another textbook, and I selected Science Under Siege by Peter Hotez and Michel. But then after talking with some friends and colleagues, they said to me, you could get in big trouble. If you are familiar with this book of Michael Mann and Peter Hotez, they criticize strongly Republicans and Trump. Well, I don't pretend to advocate for one side or the other. I want to be subjective as possible. But however, we are living now in a moment when truth doesn't matter too much. What it matters more is your advocate for what anybody thinks was truth. And unfortunately, in the southeastern United States, we have a lot of this partisanship. And I have seen some students that are very pro anti-science somehow. And I don't want to get in really too much trouble. Yeah. I am not an American citizen. I'm here in a H-1B visa. I don't want to jeopardize my green card application. And I usually make some jokes to say, well, I could say a little bit more about this policy against science and against conservation, biology, and all that, but I don't want to be deported. My question is, what advice can you give for dealing with maybe hypersensitive students that they have made their mind, they are partisans, anti climate change research, anti-vaccines? Can you give some advices how to deal with that.
Yeah. If I knew how to fix the United States, I would have done it already. Um, I sympathize with you because I'm starting a new course this winter called The Bible and Western Culture. It's a humanities course. It's a history of ideas course. I plan to tell students who come from a latently Catholic culture about the Bible and church history, largely Catholic church history. I'm not using this as a pulpit, but I have colleagues who have already expressed grumblings behind my back. I don't know who, but I keep getting these emails saying, people are talking about this course. I'm like, it passed all of the steps to be accepted as a course in my department, but for some reason they're politics, right? So I'm saying this as a comparison because in Quebec, for example, there's a hostility towards organized religion, primarily towards Islam, but also because a lot of the politicians are former Catholics who felt that the Catholic Church had been too powerful when they were young. So I sympathize with you with this kind of fear that whatever we say in class will be damned if we do and damned if we don't. My approach tends to be to try to show that conspiracy theories occur on both sides of the political fence, right? In Canada, there's not just one fence because we have many political parties, not just two, but if we split into left and right, it's useful to show that conspiracy belief, or in your case, science, what do you call it? Has
Denialism.
yes, pseudoscience or science denialism. Thank you. Happens on both sides of the political fence. Robert Kennedy Jr. was not a Republican until Donald Trump came around. A lot of his beliefs, his anti-vaccine beliefs, came largely from the left. Now, he might actually be right on some things. I'm looking forward to him, getting rid of hot dogs in schools or whatever. I think that would probably be a good thing for a lot of American kids. But the problem is it's wrapped up with a lot of other things. So if your students tend to, skew to the right, and maybe Bobby Kennedy Jr. is not the best person right now, find something that they would agree and go, oh, wow. The one that I would suggest is ufology. I don't know if you're familiar with ufology, but ufology is largely a left-leaning pseudoscience that has been thoroughly debunked, largely by left-leaning scientists and influencers. There's a great podcast called Skeptoid by Brian Dunning, little 20-minute podcast that promotes science. It's actually quite anti-religious sometimes, but Brian does a great job debunking conspiracy theories and pseudoscientific claims. And if you start with things like vaccines or ufology, or not necessarily vaccines, but something that particularly appeals to the left, then what happens is you're allowing them to realize that you're not coming after them or their worldview. But that would allow later on to look at issues like, say, climate change and encourage them to take a careful look at the various theories and counter theories. So I don't know if that helps, Oscar, but I think being able to show that there are a multiplicity of types of pseudoscience or conspiracy theories, and they appeal both to to people of different sides, that might help. What's the word in French? Is désamorcer, to kind of when you to prevent a bomb from blowing up, if you prefer.
Well, I have a question here. This is from the essay called Testing Teachings and Torching Teachers. And the author emphasizes the idea of convenient truth, which I thought was interesting. Claims that convenient truths are those that fit nicely with your pre-existing beliefs, as well as things that are negative things that reinforce your perceived enemies and the positions of your perceived enemies, and that those convenient truths are less likely to be tested. So things that either agree with your preconceived ideas or provide a counter that you see as an enemy keeps reinforcing your ideas. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I noticed he mentions two things. He says that a lot of conspiracy believers, and Christians included, sin by negligence, by not spending enough time looking at evidence, and then sin by excess, by overly scrutinizing the people they disagree with, right? So there's a tendency to do personal attacks at the expense of actually looking at the evidence. And I think a lot of this essay focuses on the problem of, I don't know if he uses the word echo chambers. I think he used the word information bubbles, but and this is unfortunate, in the culture wars in the United States, and this happens in Quebec, in Canada as well, between Quebec and the other provinces, there's a regional division of opinion groups. So when you go to the supermarket or you go to school or you go to work, you tend to run into a lot of people who are like you, as opposed to being in a big city where those people kind of mingle around, right? So in fact, where was I listening to that just recently? I was listening to, I think it was a podcast that talked about bear hunting in Michigan that actually brings in hunting aficionados from both left-wing and right-wing perspectives, and they tend to get to know each other, and they don't really care about politics when they get together, but they get to understand the person from the other side. Now, if you like bears, you might not like this because they're all both, shooting and catching bears, but it's one of those community activities where people tend to mingle more, and they get to see that, oh, not all people on the left wing are, climate denialists. Not everybody, sorry, on the right wing, not everybody on the left wing is, I don't know, some kind of new age crystal gazing, hippie or something like that. So yeah, I think the issue here is largely about the bubbles that we maintain. And before this started, I kind of wrote down a few possible solutions to conspiracy beliefs, and one of them addressed what you're asking here. If we're able to be exposed to multiple points of view, then we're more likely to see that the world is full of gray nuance, not black and white. And some churches do this well in the sense that they mingle with other denominations or they invite others. I go to an evangelical Mennonite church, but we also keep the calendar of the Catholic festivals. We have lay time and normal time during the year. We practice Lent. So it's kind of strange, but that means that, the Catholics, they're doing something good over there. I like doing the Lectio Divina, those kinds of things. I might not engage in a prayer to Mary, but I've understood that although we have different ways of expressing our faith, we're still focused on the same Messiah. And I think that's also useful in a general sense in being able to read other people's opinions. Now, I have to admit, sometimes I'll read something that I find very aversive. I disagree with it. But I'll put it down and I'll think about it before I write an angry email or an article about it. So it's useful for Christians to read broadly, even to read authors that we disagree with, and even to befriend people that we wouldn't normally befriend. One of my colleagues in this whole conspiracy critiquing community is Michael Shermer. Michael Shermer is the editor of Skeptic magazine. He's an ardent atheist. He grew up as an evangelical and completely rejected it. He's been on my podcast. I've been on his podcast. Every now and then he chides me about something about Jesus or Christianity. I answer as well as I can, I think. At the end of the day, we're still friends. And I keep telling, I know you don't believe in God, Michael, but I'm still praying for you, So I think when we're able to maintain the idea that these people are not our enemies, but they can be colleagues in searching for truth, we might arrive at different conclusions, and that would help. And that really helps to break down the idea of the echo chamber, to try to befriend the other. One thing that I said when I spoke at the Harvard Divinity School a few years ago about that, the scapegoating essay, is that when we look for allies, we're building fortifications in a war. But when we look for friends, we're leveling the fortifications and we're actually building, community. If you think of World War I, if you're looking for allies, you had the French on one side, the German on the other. But on the Christmas truce, they both got out of the trenches. They played soccer together, right? So if our attitudes each day is, yeah, there are some serious divisions going on, but we can still play soccer together, then that really helps for us to be able to break down those echo chambers, to see some of our biases and being able to contact others about theirs. I'm in a retirement village here where my mom lives. There are a lot of Hasidic Jews. I hear a lot of people who are not Hasidic having a lot of irritations towards that community because they're buying a lot of property. There's a lot of them, when they're in the pool, it feels like they took over the pool. All the ladies show up and it's like a gaggle of crows or something like that. But I was walking around last night. I met a few. They looked at me. I said, Shabbat Shalom. And they smiled and they waved back. So, I'm not here long term, but those kinds of things build bridges. And at the end of the day, maybe if I were here a bit longer, I might have a nice conversation on a park bench about the fact that I follow Rabbi Yeshua, and we could maybe agree to disagree, but at the same time learn from each other. So I think that could be very useful. And I think that essay does point out the fact that if we're going to war, we're never going to change other people's minds. But if we're trying to make friends, we're sometimes going to change minds, and our minds might change too. If we're looking for truth, great, we're going to get closer to the truth.
What you say reminds me a lot of Francis Collins' book, The Road to Wisdom, which a lot of people in the ASA have been working through. We've had Francis Collins is a valued member of the ASA, and with very much that same approach to things.
Yeah. I have a friend who worked in the Human Genome Project, and he also likes Collins. I read one of his books. I forget the one that defended theism, something God in the title.
The Language of God.
That's it. I read that one last year. Yeah, very good. So when I'm teaching in my class, and most of my students come from a non-religious background, so they would think that creationism is something ludicrous and crazy. I can present them the ideas of somebody like Francis Collins as part of a spectrum of beliefs, from absolute naturalism to absolute supernaturalism, or people who take Genesis 1 absolutely literally as science. And then I can show that a guy like Francis Collins is in the middle, as is Pope John Paul II, or other people who've spoken on this. And then we can say, oh, religion is not necessarily you believe in these crazy things or you believe in science. There's a lot of people trying to figure out how religion works and how science works, and some of them are the same people.
Thank you very much, Michel. That was very helpful and very profitable discussion. So in closing, next month, we'll be pleased to have Scott Walkes, professor of international politics and director of general education at Malone University in Canton, Ohio. And we will be discussing his review of a book called Generations, the real differences between Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, boomers, and silence. And I'm in the process of reading that book now. And it is very informative, and it's loaded with statistics. If you like statistics, it is overflowing with statistics, and often gives a very interesting perspective on the experiences of different generations and how that's molded our culture. So once again, thank you, Michel, for sharing with us. And for everybody else, be sure to join us again in February for interview with Scott Walkes. And from all of us here at the ASA and diving to deeper discussions, may God richly bless you in the coming month. God bless.
Thank you very much. Can I just add one thing? I put my email address, my podcast email address, on the chat. So it's paranoidplanet.mail@gmail.com. If anybody has a question or a rebuke, I'll accept those too. And I also have a website. It's paranoidplanet.ca, CA for Canada. And I have a lot of articles that are linked on there, and episodes from my podcast. So if anybody's interested, I'll type that in right now as well.
So thanks, Keith, for guest hosting and being Diving Deeper team, and thank you, Michel, for being here.
Thank you, Vicky.
Yeah, really great discussion. 2 weeks from today, I just want to remind everybody, will be our 6th annual Winter Symposium. We have Say Kim, who is a board member of the ASA, facilitating a discussion on the science of forgiveness and the role of Christian character and virtue in worship, with John and Charlotte Whitveley, who are scholars at Belmont University. And as a reminder, Winter Symposium is our outward-facing public event. So we'd love for you to come and invite your friends, family members, your pastors, people in your churches as a way to experience the ASA. We also have funding for watch parties. So we typically have a dozen or more watch parties around North America, people that want to gather in homes, churches, chapters, whatever. So if you're interested in hosting a watch party, reach out to Janelle or I. And again, we have funding available for that. Secondly, our call for abstracts is active and live now, and the deadline is coming up at the end of January for our 80th annual meeting at Gordon College, which is here in the Boston area where I'm located. So feel free to submit an abstract poster, encourage students in your midst to do the same. And then finally, Oscar, I was encouraged to hear that you're using Francis's book in your class. And just as a reminder to the rest of you, Francis is graciously offered to come in for a second discussion on February 17th, and it's not too late to start a book group. We still have a whole inventory of books in the office, and we're able to offer them for $5 a piece. So if you're interested in getting a group together, again, reach out to us as well. So thank you, everyone, and Happy New Year. Good to see everybody today.